word we use every day. A word so familiar we never question it. Poverty. We see it on the news. We donate to fight it. We build charities around it. Politicians promise to end it. Economists write papers about managing it. But here's what nobody tells you. For 95% of human existence, this word didn't exist. Not because people were rich, but because poverty, as we know it, hadn't been invented yet. And when it was invented, it wasn't an accident. It was a choice. 40,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now France, a woman kneels by a fire. Her hands are scarred from a lifetime of work, digging roots, scraping hides, carrying water from the river. By our standards, she owns nothing. No house, no savings, no property. She can't read or write. She has no currency. By our definition, she should be desperately poor. But she isn't. Tonight, her family will eat because 3 hunters brought down a deer this morning. She watched them drag it into camp, watched the men divide it with stone knives, watched every family receive a portion. Tomorrow, another family will share their gathered berries and wild onions. Next week, when her child develops a fever, the group's healer will tend to him, not for payment, but because that's what the healer does. That's her role. Just as the woman's role is to process hides that everyone will use for clothing. She has no wealth, but she also cannot be destitute. The group won't allow it, not out of charity, out of survival. Because next month, it might be the hunter who gets injured. It might be the healer's child who needs feeding. The circle holds because everyone knows they might need it to hold them. This is how humans lived for tens of thousands of years. You couldn't be poor because there was nothing to own. You couldn't be rich because there was nothing to hoard. Status came from skill, from courage, from generosity. A great hunter didn't accumulate meat, he gave it away. That generosity was his wealth. His reputation was his security. Then everything changed. Not because of war, not because of disease, because of wheat. 12,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, someone had an idea. What if we stopped following the food and made it come to us? The first farmers appeared. They cleared land, planted seeds, waited through seasons, harvested. And for the first time in human history, food could pile up. Grain could be stored in clay pots and sealed rooms. Surplus could exist beyond today, beyond this week, beyond this season. This should have been humanity's triumph. Instead, it created a problem no one saw coming. In a hunter-gatherer band, you share today's catch because it will rot by tomorrow. Hoarding makes no sense. But grain? Grain lasts. Grain can be saved for months, even years if stored properly. Grain can be counted, measured, weighed. And the moment something can be counted, someone will want to control who counts it. The first granaries appeared. Massive mud brick structures in the centres of early villages in Sumer, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley. At first, they were communal. Everyone contributed after harvest. Everyone took what they needed when food ran low. But then someone asked a dangerous question. Who decides what needed means? A family of 4. Do they need the same as a family of 6? What about the old woman who can't work the fields anymore? What about the potter who makes vessels but doesn't farm? What about the priest who tends the temple? Someone had to make these decisions. Someone had to keep records. Someone had to have authority. And the moment that authority existed, everything changed. The granaries grew larger. The villages became towns, then cities. And quietly, invisibly, the nature of human survival shifted. A class of administrators emerged: priests, scribes, record keepers, officials. They didn't farm. They didn't hunt. They didn't build. They managed. They decided how much grain each family deserved, who had contributed enough, who owed more. In ancient Sumer, clay tablets recorded every transaction with ruthless precision. Name, amount, date, obligation. We still have these tablets. You can see them in museums, covered in cuneiform wedges pressed into clay 5,000 years ago. They're not poetry. They're not prayers. They're accounting records. Debts. That word is new. Debt. Because now, for the first time in human history, survival wasn't guaranteed by the group. It depended on pleasing the people who controlled the grain. A bad harvest, a sick child, a fire that destroyed your crop, a flood that ruined your field. Suddenly, you owed, not to your neighbor, not to your family, but to the institution, the temple, the palace, the state. And debt, they discovered, was the most powerful chain ever invented. You couldn't see it. You couldn't break it with your hands. And it could be passed down to your children like an inheritance of servitude. Let me give you one example from the records. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 1750 BCE, there was a farmer. His name is recorded as Namu. He borrowed grain during a drought to feed his family and plant next season's crop. But the drought continued. His harvest failed. The tablet records what happened next. Namu, his wife Ninshatapada, and their 3 children entered into service to the temple of Enlil. Period of service, until the debt is cleared. The debt was never cleared. 30 years later, another tablet mentions his son, still working temple land. 50 years after that, his grandson. 3 generations of one family, bound to an institution because of grain borrowed during a drought. This wasn't punishment for a crime. This was simply how the system worked. Namu wasn't evil. The priests weren't monsters. This was civilization. This was order. This was progress. And it required people at the bottom. Egypt perfected the system. During the building of the pyramids, workers were paid in grain rations, carefully calculated, just enough to survive, never enough to leave. The overseers kept detailed records of every basket of grain distributed. If you didn't show up for your work assignment, your family's ration was cut. The monuments that we marvel at today were built by people who had nowhere else to go. Rome industrialized it. By the height of the empire, 1% of the population, roughly 2,000 families, owned more than half of all land in Italy. Not because they were smarter, not because they worked harder, because centuries earlier, when Rome was just a village on 7 hills, their ancestors had been the ones standing near the granary when the rules were written. Their descendants inherited empires built on that original advantage. The poor, and now there were poor, millions of them, built the roads these elites travelled on, farmed the estates that fed them, fought the wars that expanded their territory, died in the Colosseum for their entertainment. And if you asked a Roman senator why this was fair, he would look at you strangely. This wasn't oppression. This was simply the natural order. This was civilization. Some people were meant to lead. Some were meant to follow. Some were meant to struggle. That's just how the world worked. The poor, he might tell you, had always existed, but he would be wrong. Medieval Europe inherited the blueprint and refined it. The feudal system wasn't an accident. It was Roman inequality wrapped in new language. Serfs were tied to land they didn't own, working for lords who controlled their survival. A serf couldn't leave, couldn't marry without permission, couldn't make decisions about their own life. They weren't slaves in name, but the difference was academic. The pattern repeated across every continent. Chinese dynasties extracted grain through brutal tax systems. Indian rulers enforced caste hierarchies that determined your worth from birth. Middle Eastern empires controlled water rights, ensuring farmers remained dependent. African kingdoms built wealth through tribute systems that concentrated resources at the top. Everywhere civilization spread, this same structure appeared. Not because it was natural, because it worked. If you were the one writing the rules. We inherited this system. Every part of it. The idea that survival should depend on employment, that's the granary, just renamed. The concept that land should be owned by some and rented by others, that's Roman latifundia in modern clothing. The belief that debt is a personal failing rather than a structural feature, that's 5,000 years of conditioning. The assumption that there will always be people at the bottom because that's just how economies work. That's the voice of every administrator who ever stood in front of a clay tablet deciding who deserved to eat. None of this is natural. None of this is inevitable. All of it was designed, refined, and passed down through generations who convinced themselves it was simply the way things had to be. Walk into any modern city and you'll see the granaries. We just call them banks now. The record keepers are still there, tracking every transaction in digital ledgers instead of clay. The debt tablets still exist, just invisible, stored in databases that determine whether you can buy a home, start a business, or escape the cycle. The people at the bottom are still building the roads, harvesting the fields, staffing the warehouses, fighting the wars. The costumes changed. The architecture got taller. The technology became more sophisticated. But the blueprint remained exactly the same. Concentrate resources, control access, make survival dependent on permission from those who control the system. For 100,000 years, humans lived without poverty. It took just 12,000 years of civilization to create it, refine it, perfect it, normalize it, and convince everyone it was natural law. But here's the thing about inventions. What can be created can be dismantled. What was designed can be redesigned. What was built by human choice can be rebuilt by human choice. The woman by the fire, 40,000 years ago. She didn't know she was living in a world without poverty. She just knew that when someone was hungry, they were fed. When someone was hurt, they were healed. When someone was struggling, the group carried them. Not because they were saints, because that's how survival worked. We invented a different way. We built a system where survival is a prize you have to earn, where security is something you purchase, where falling means falling alone. The question isn't whether we can afford to change it. The question is, if we built this world, why do we keep pretending we can't build a different one?